Secretary Blinken, we've seen several reported leaks in the Nord Stream pipeline system that Germany has said could be an act of sabotage. What's the U.S. assessment of what we're seeing there, particularly given previous Russian moves to curtail gas supplies? And can you speak a little bit more broadly to the pressure that Europe is coming under as winter and a potential energy crisis looms? External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, thank you for taking our questions. First, I'm wondering if you could offer India's perspective on U.S. efforts to implement a global price cap on Russian energy. Would India consider joining that kind of price cap mechanism, and do you see it as potentially a way for India as well as other countries in the global south to get more leverage and negotiate even cheaper prices for fuel? And just a second question, if I may, can you talk a little bit about India's plans going forward for military hardware and equipment, given the sanctions that the U.S. and others are putting on Russian industry, and given India's historic reliance on Russian technology? How is India trying to head off challenges related to Russia being potentially unable to service that equipment going forward as a result of sanctions? Can Russia still fulfill all of India's requirements? And will India look at perhaps more purchases of, say, American or Israeli military equipment? Thank you.
Ian, thanks very much. On the question on energy security and Nord Stream in particular, a few things. The leaks are under investigation. There are initial reports indicating that this may be the result of an attack or some kind of sabotage, but these are initial reports and we haven't confirmed that yet. But if it is confirmed, that's clearly in no one's interest. Now, my understanding is the leaks will not have a significant impact on Europe's energy resilience. And what's critical is that we are working day in, day out, both on a short-term basis and a long-term basis, to address energy security for Europe and for that matter, around the world. Short-term, just to cite a few examples, we are working on implementing the oil price cap to keep Russian oil flowing, but at a steep discount. That, of course, will deny Russia excess revenues that it would use to prosecute its aggression against Ukraine, and at the same time, as I said, keep oil flowing on world markets. We're working to continue to surge LNG supplies to Europe in cooperation with global partners, including in the Indo-Pacific. It's worth noting that our own oil production is up by more than 500,000 barrels per day this year. Our LNG exports are up more than 20% since last year. In fact, we became the largest LNG supplier to the European Union and the UK this year. And we've become the largest overall LNG exporter this year. And of course, as you know, we've been tapping into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at unprecedented levels. Others are doing the same. This is having an impact both on supply and on price. Long term, we're supporting efforts to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, including LNG over the long term, including through a task force that we established with the European Union some months ago on energy security that's working very actively, looking at ways both to reduce demand, to pursue renewables, to make the transition. And then we're working with global partners to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and accelerate the transition to renewables beyond Europe. It's a long way of saying that there are clear challenges in the months ahead that we're addressing, but there is also a very significant opportunity to do two things. One, to finally end the dependence of Europe on Russian energy, and thus the position that Europe is in of being on the receiving end of the weaponization of energy by Russia, and also to accelerate the transition to renewables and to make sure that we're addressing the climate challenge that we face. So we can and we are working to do all of this in a way that provides energy security for Europeans and not only gets us through the next months, but leaves us in a better, stronger position for the years ahead.
On the price cap, we had a brief discussion on it this morning. More technical people are engaged between the two systems on this particular subject. It is, of course, a G7 initiative. Now, you have to understand that in the last few months, the energy markets are already under very great stress. Countries in the global south have found it difficult to compete for limited energy, not just in terms of pricing, escalating pricing, but often in terms of availability. There are tenders, countries have had tenders for which they don't even get a reply from suppliers. So our concern right now is that energy markets already under stress must soften up. We would judge any situation, frankly, by how it affects us and other countries of the global south, because as I communicated to the Secretary, there is a very, very deep concern among developing countries about how their energy security needs are addressed or not. On the military equipment, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think in recent months we have faced any particular problems in terms of servicing and spare parts supply of equipment that we have got in the past from Russia. Whether where we get our military equipment and platforms from, that's not an issue, honestly, which is a new issue or an issue which has particularly changed because of geopolitical tensions. I think we look at possibilities across the world. We look at the quality of technology, the quality of capability, the terms on which that particular equipment is offered, and we exercise a choice which we believe is in our national interest. Now, if you were to look at the last 15 years, for example, you can see that we have actually procured a lot from the United States. If you were to consider, for example, aircraft, the C-17, the C-130, the P-8, or the Apache helicopter, or the Chinooks, or the howitzers, the M777 howitzers. We have done so from France. I mean, we bought recently the Rafale aircraft. We have done so from Israel. So we have a tradition of multi-sourcing, and for us, how to get the optimal deal from a competitive situation is really what this is all about.
We'll next turn to Lalit Jha, Trust of India.
Thanks, Ned. Thanks, Mr. Minister. You have been associated with this India-US relationship for decades and dealt with, you have been dealing with this India-US relationship for decades and dealt multiple leadership, multiple administrations. What is your overall sense of the trajectory of the relationship? And Mr. Secretary, I would like to pick up a few points from your opening remarks. First, you said you discussed to strengthen a strategic partnership, and this includes helping each other. Mm-hmm. The recent decision of U.S. To provide 450 million FM sales on F-16 maintenance package certainly doesn't help India's strategic national interest. Everyone knows where F-16 has been used in the past and where it will be used. Certainly is not being used for counter-terrorism operation, if you can help us understand that. On India's role in Ukraine, can you give us a sense what India can play a role in Ukraine peace process, given that Prime Minister Modi's recent remarks to President Putin and Mexico's proposal of a 3-member committee, including Prime Minister Modi, His Holiness Pope, and UN Secretary General to help resolve peace, bring peace in Ukraine. And finally, on your comments on Indian Americans, Indian Americans have played a big role in this relationship, and they are big supporters of Democratic Party. But there's frustration brewing up among this community as well because of the 700 days of visa waiting period among Indian Americans when they ask their friends and families and parents to come from India. All the embassies and consulates are giving them first appointment they are getting of 2024. Thank you, sir.
Those were 6 questions bundled into one.
It's very impressive. It's very impressive. I think you topped our colleague Ian. And so.
Thank you. Well, look, I think the Secretary was good enough to refer to something I said on the weekend to a group of Indian Americans and Indians who live here, which is that the big change that I have seen in my 4 decades as a diplomat was actually in the transformation of India-US relations. And your question, how do I see the trajectory? Quite honestly, I see today a United States very international, very much more to engaging, very much more open to engaging a country like India, which is actually thinking beyond traditional alliances, which has been very effective at finding common ground with potential or actual partners. And a very good example of all this is actually in the Quad. The fact was, a Quad was something we tried about 2 decades, 15 years ago. It didn't work. And it is working very well today, and is doing, it's grown remarkably in the course of the last 2 years. So I think for us, today the relationship with the US opens up a whole range of possibilities not just with the United States, though those are important in themselves, because I think at this point of time, there's so much that India, and I assume the US too, stands to benefit from working with the United States, whether it's economy, with its technology, with its security. But the other part is also, I would say, it's been for us a very positive experience, a very encouraging one with a lot of promise of working with the US to shape the direction of the world. To me, that's really the big jump which we have made. I think the more we work together, the more we engage each other, I think many more possibilities will come. So very frankly, that's a long way of saying that I'm very bullish about the relationship.
I can only echo, first of all, what Mr. Jaishankar said. I think no 2 countries have a greater ability, and I think opportunity and responsibility to try to shape the future of the century in the United States and India as the world's 2 largest democracies. And what is very gratifying to me is the fact that in all of these meetings, in all of these conversations, in this ongoing dialogue we have, we are thinking together and working together in ways that we haven't before. That doesn't mean that we don't have differences. We do, and we will. But it also means that because of the depth and quality of the dialogue we have, we talk about everything and work closely together on how we can advance the agenda that we have in common, which, as you've heard, I think, from both of us, extends to virtually every issue that is confronting our own citizens and people around the world. On the specific questions you raised, on the F-16s, to be very clear, and it's important, this is a sustainment program for F-16s that Pakistan has long had. These are not new planes, new systems, new weapons. It's sustaining what they have. We have a responsibility and an obligation to whomever we provide military equipment to make sure that it's maintained and sustained. That's our obligation. Pakistan's program bolsters its capability to deal with terrorist threats emanating from Pakistan or from the region. It's in no one's interest that those threats be able to go forward with impunity. And so this capability that Pakistan has had can benefit all of us in dealing with terrorism. On the question of visas, I'm extremely sensitive to this. If it's any consolation, I can tell you that this is a challenge that we're facing around the world, and it's a product largely of the COVID pandemic. Our ability to issue visas dropped dramatically during COVID, and without boring you with all of the details, this is the one self-financing part of the State Department. That is, around the world, the fees that we get for issuing visas are go to our budget, and they go to our capacity to put in place the people needed to process the visas. When COVID hit, the demand for visas fell through the floor. Visa fees went away. The system as a whole suffered. And then, of course, in actually issuing visas, even with much more limited resources, we had constraints from COVID about the number of people we could have in our embassies at any one time, et cetera. We are now building back very determinedly from that. Surging resources. We have a plan when it comes to India to address the backlog of visas that's built up. I think you'll see that play out in the coming months, but it's something that we're very focused on. These connections, these people-to-people ties, whether it's students, whether it's business people, whether it's tourists, whether it's family, this is what really links us together, and the last thing we want to do is make that any more difficult. On the contrary, we want to facilitate it. So bear with us. This will play out over the next few months, but we're very focused on it. Finally, India's role when it comes to Ukraine, a potential peace process. I really want to emphasize what Prime Minister Modi said, because I think he captured, as well as anyone I've heard, fundamentally what this moment is about. As he said, this is not an era, this is not a time for war. We could not agree more. We saw the aggression, the threat of the aggression mounting from Russia against Ukraine last year. We warned the world about it, and we tried everything possible to avert it through diplomacy. Unfortunately, tragically, President Putin pursued his aggression nonetheless. And now the Ukrainian people, but also the world, are reaping the consequences. We see this not only in the suffering of the Ukrainian people, the decimation of their country by Russian forces, but we see it also in the profound threat to the United Nations Charter that binds us together, the basic principles that are so necessary to keep peace and security around the world that came to being after 2 world wars: sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence. They are being challenged. And we're seeing the consequences in everything from rising food insecurity to the energy prices that we've talked about. So it's profoundly in everyone's interest for Russia to stop its aggression. But it really is incumbent upon Russia and President Putin to decide that this is what it's going to do. One person has the ability to stop this aggression tomorrow, and that's Vladimir Putin. And as I said last week, if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends, because Russia has seized territory through this aggression that makes it challenging for Ukraine to sustain its viability. So this is incumbent upon President Putin. We are very determined that if there is any opportunity for meaningful diplomacy to try to end the war, we will be part of it. But as of this date, speaking to you today, we continue to see no signs from Russia and President Putin that they're prepared to engage in meaningful diplomacy, in a negotiation that would lead to a just resolution of the aggression. It is on Russia, it is on President Putin, and we will see if they finally respond. I think it's very important, though, that voices as consequential as India's make themselves heard, and that's why I thought the Prime Minister's comments were so significant.
For the war in Ukraine to end. And then to follow up on your response to my colleague on conversations about a price cap on oil. You said that was briefly discussed during your meeting with the Secretary today, but it seems that you still have concerns, and right now India is not in favor of a cap on Russian oil. So is that accurate, and what would change that position? And Secretary Blinken, one question on Iran and one question on Ukraine. With the new Treasury General licenses last week, there are still technical hurdles when it comes to getting internet to Iranians. So I'm wondering what more the United States could do, and if the United States would work with private companies if they were to try and physically get hardware into Iran to make sure that they could facilitate the distribution of internet to the country. And then the second question on Russia, what cost will the United States impose on Russia if it annexes these Ukrainian territories that are holding these so-called referendums? And will the U.S. still allow Ukrainian troops to use U.S. weaponry to defend against Russians in those territories, no matter what the outcome of these referendums and these possible annexations? Thank you.
Yeah?
Please.
Yep. We have taken the position privately, publicly, confidentially, consistently from February 24th that this conflict is not in anybody's interest. And we've always advocated that the best way forward is to return to dialogue and diplomacy. Now, your question, are we actively working on something? In the past, wherever we have been able to contribute something, we have been open to it. And I remain in very active touch with a lot of my colleagues in the G20, colleagues in the UN Security Council, some beyond. So just as an example, during the grain shipment discussions in the Black Sea, at that time we had been approached to also weigh in with Russia at a particularly delicate moment of those discussions, which we did. Right now, there are some issues. I had a meeting with the Prime Minister of Ukraine. He did mention some very specific concerns which he thought merited our attention, where he thought we could be of some use. I had, on a different set of issues, a discussion with the UN Secretary General. He's been very active, as you know, on a whole lot of specific concerns pertaining to the conflict. So it's not necessarily the overarching peace prospect, but even in the current scenario, are there issues which we can solve or in some way mitigate or ameliorate? So there was some discussion with the UN Secretary General as well. I don't think it would be right for me to kind of go into specifics at this time. Do we have concerns? This is in respect to your oil question. Look, we have concerns about the price of oil. But we are a $2,000 per capita economy. The price of oil is breaking our back. That is our big concern.
Kylie, first on Iran. First things first. Asa should be alive today. The only reason she's not is because a brutal regime took her life, and took her life because of decisions she should be making about what she would wear or not wear. Women in Iran have the right to wear what they want. They have the right to be free from violence. They have the right to be free from harassment. That's true in Iran. It's true, should be true everywhere. So, for starters, Iran needs to end its use of violence against women for exercising what should be a fundamental freedom. And as a general proposition, and in this specific instance, we stand with all of those who are exercising the universal right to peaceful protest. As you noted, we've also taken action. And two things I would point to. We designated the so-called morality police and specific individuals for human rights abuses. And that imposes sanctions on them, and it would impose as well sanctions on anyone who seeks to, in any way, do business with them. And then, more specifically to the point you raised, we announced a general license to facilitate the free flow of information inside Iran. So, for example, what this does is It authorizes companies to provide things like cloud services, privacy technology, security technology, hardware and software to enable the Iranians to better communicate among themselves and also with the rest of the world. Individual companies can come to us, to OFAC in this case, to determine whether their technology fits under the license, and we will certainly look for ways to facilitate technology services being made accessible to people in Iran. On the question of Russia and the sham referenda and annexations that seem to be proceeding in Ukraine. One, we've been very clear that we are prepared and we will impose additional severe and swift costs on Russia for proceeding with the annexations. And again, it's important to remember what's going on here. Russia invaded Ukraine, seized territory, and is engaged in a diabolical scheme on some of the territory it seized, where it has moved the local populace out, often through these filtration centers, where people may be deported to Russia, elsewhere in Ukraine, or they simply disappear. Then they bus Russians in, they install puppet governments, and then they engage in the referendum and manipulate in any event the outcome to then claim that the territory belongs to Russia through annexation. We and many other countries have already been crystal clear. We will not, indeed we will never recognize the annexation of Ukrainian territory by Russia. And I've also been equally clear that Ukraine has the absolute right to defend itself throughout its territory, including to take back the territory that has been illegally seized one way or another by Russia. And the equipment, the weapons that we and many other countries are providing them have been used very effectively to do just that, as we've seen in northeast Ukraine and as we see as well in the south. And again, because there is no change at all in the territory that is being annexed by the Russians as a matter for us or for the Ukrainians will continue to do what they need to do to get back the land that has been taken from them. We will continue to support them in that effort.
We'll take a final question from Rina Bardwaj. I'm sorry, Nazira, we don't have time. From Rina Bardwaj, Asian News International.
Minister Jaishankar and Secretary Blinken, thank you for doing this. Minister Jaishankar, you've had a very busy week at UNGA, meeting all your counterparts. Did they express their worries about Ukraine, which you mentioned in your remarks, of course, but also Taiwan? And did you discuss the impact of these developments on the global economy with Secretary Blinken? How are the two countries going to work together to address these concerns? And my second question to Secretary Blinken is, you talked about F-16 and the obligation that the U.S. has, but can you further clarify what terror threats does Pakistan face, and why is there a need for these fighter jets? Also, there's a discussion with your Pakistani counterpart to improve ties with India and to make the region more stable. What was their response? You did give them an advice to maintain peace. What was the advice that you gave them?
I had, of course, a lot of meetings in the UN that week. I met, I guess, roughly about half the delegations who were there. And a common concern among them was the anxiety about global economic volatility and anxiety about, sharply increased energy prices, of food inflation and food availability, of fertilizers which will impact food next year, of disrupted trade, of shipping, of insurance, of airline movements, of travel. So this was honestly not an optimistic global mood which you got from your colleagues. And I think in particular what the impact, the consequences of the Ukraine conflict has been on many of these issues I spoke about. And also, I think the prospect of instability or in the Indo-Pacific, because today Asia and Indo-Pacific is so central to global trade, and particularly in some very critical areas. So these were very, very widely prevalent concerns. We had a good discussion about it yesterday evening. We do think today, I mean, I speak for India, but I also speak to some degree for the relationship having an impact on the world. We think the right thing today is to find ways of stabilizing the global economy, of softening prices, of making sure that global trade is more predictable, that the sources of anxieties and tensions are less. Because at the end of the day, that's really, Prime Minister Modi, of course, said this is not an era of war, but this is an era of where we seek development, where we seek prosperity, where we seek progress. And I think India nationally and India through its key partners would like to do more to strengthen those trends.
On the question of the F-16s again, and it's important to be very clear, this is, as I said, about sustaining an existing program, not adding a new one, and we have a responsibility to do that wherever we're engaged in the provision of defense equipment like F-16s. And second, as to what these are for, there are clear terrorism threats that continue to emanate from Pakistan itself, as well as from neighboring countries, and whether it is TTP that may be targeting Pakistan, whether it's ISIS Khorasan, whether it's Al-Qaeda. I think the threats are clear, well known, and we all have an interest in making sure that we have the means to deal with them, and that's what this is about. More broadly, we always encourage our friends to resolve their differences through diplomacy, through dialogue. That hasn't changed. It won't change. It would not be appropriate for me to characterize Pakistan's response, just as I wouldn't characterize our friend's response in a similar conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Your Excellencies.
Secretary, any comment about Afghanistan? Afghan women still doesn't have a chance to go to school.